Good morning. Happy Wednesday, everyone. This is Jane Wolfsky, your partner for bookkeeping and operational support, and I have Irene Sineska, who's your partner for employment law. And today we're going to be talking about onboarding employees or contractors. So, from our accounting standpoint, what we usually say, if you have somebody who's going to be a contractor, make sure you take their W-9 information, which is going to have their address, social security, or the EIN number if it's a company. But a lot of people, when you're going to be paying a contractor, you could really just send money. You could give a check or just do an electronic payment. And a lot of people forget that. And when it's time to file a 1099 and at the end of January, we're scrambling to find because some people just don't respond. So it's very important to have that on file. And then when we have an employee, it becomes a little bit easier because let's say if we're using a payroll provider, you're going to need to collect all the information first before you could process any payroll. So the information that you should get from the employees would be a I-9, which is an employment eligibility verification, a social security number, home address, a date of birth, and direct deposit, which is mostly used for everybody right now to process, payroll much quicker. And there's this signed copy of a W-4, which is the employee's withholding certificate. This is where we have people put their dependents and how they're going to be taxed for state and federal. And this is sometimes we have to help some of our employees with filling out those forms. But for the most part, everything is more or less straightforward. We just have to get all the information in order and then enter that in our payroll system so that everybody's kind of ready to pay in a good standpoint. So the forms that are being filled out and filed on the behalf of our clients, that everything, there's no issues, that nobody's coming back. So it's important to do that from day one. And for us, it's a very sort of straightforward checklist, but I kind of wanted to go back to Irene and talk about some of the things that are worth to consider from the legal standpoint.
Thank you so much, Jane. Happy Wednesday, everyone. So, of course, we start, even in our practice, we start all onboarding with accounting and all the state forms and all the federal forms that Jane just talked about. That's always our first step. But then from the legal point, I always recommend that everybody has an employment agreement. The employment agreement is very, very important to set out the terms of employment. If it's ever called into question later, we've talked about this in a few other podcasts, through the Department of Labor, or if there's any question on the benefits that should have been provided, including PTO, it's very important to have that written out in that employment agreement. So anything negotiated should be written in there. Also, we've briefly touched up in the past on a mutual arbitration agreement and how it's important to have that as part of the policies. The mutual arbitration agreement states that any conflict between the parties is to be decided in arbitration. And oftentimes, it's of course a negotiated term, but oftentimes my clients ask about putting in a clause into the mutual arbitration agreement for the employee to waive opening a class action. Of course, cases are easier to deal with one-on-one with the employee. So what the employer is allowed to do, based on some cases that have come out in the last few years from the Supreme Court of the United States, is to waive the right to start a class action or to be part of that class action. And so again, it allows the employer to, instead of having one issue across an entire class of all employees for what could have been 3 to 6 years, depending on whether it's just a state claim or it's a federal claim as well, to really deal with it on just an employee level alone. And so that's really a really crucial piece of the employment agreement that we recommend go together hand in hand with the employment agreement, which will set out all the terms of the employment as well. In addition to that, some things to consider during onboarding, and which should be part of the policies as well, is whether this is going to be an exempt or non-exempt employee under the FLSA. And of course, there are certain rules from the type of work that the employee is going to do to the salary that they're going to receive. And we've again touched up on this briefly in the past, and on some other podcasts, we've discussed the FLSA and the overtime requirements for exempt versus non-exempt. So I would definitely refer you back to those for a little more information on the exempt versus non-exempt. But it is very important that that is something that's negotiated beforehand. In addition, New York State requires that a wage notice be filled out and signed by the employee. That wage notice would actually state whether there's separate ones for salary, and then there's salary that's exempt, salary that's non-exempt, and then there's an hourly wage notice form. It is a requirement that every single employee signs a wage notice form, both at hire, so at onboarding, or when there's a change to any salary or any wages at any point in time, up or down, they must re-sign the wage notice form at all times. Another thing to consider during the time of onboarding or negotiating terms of an agreement is going to be the PTO and vacation pay. Of course, that's something that could be increased year over year. Policies can change, and you can change that in your employee handbook. Also, something that we've discussed in the past during a different podcast is a employee handbook and what goes into it. And a lot of that is the PTO vacation pay. But in addition, part of your employment agreement would actually list the PTO. And one of the things that we recommend doing, so that it's a catch-all phrase, is really putting in your employee handbook that PTO really depends on what the employment agreement says, and that the employment agreement will control in that language. That's something that we recommend doing so that you don't have a conflict between what the employment agreement says, for example, for an employee who may have negotiated a lower salary for more PTO time versus additional time given in the employee handbook, or less time given in the employee handbook for the PTO. So it's very, very important that definitely that phrase is going to be in your employee handbook. Two other things to consider is going to be the training period, during which it's very important that you post and have the sexual harassment training. Under New York state laws, that's mandatory to take place within the first 90 days of employment. So very important that it's part of your training, and it's always my recommendation that it's sooner rather than later that training does take place. And then the last piece to consider that should be really in writing is information on benefits, especially those benefits that could potentially be under the ERISA benefit category. Very important that those are going to be written down on paper. My recommendation to my clients is, since we've talked about quite a lot of documents, what I always recommend doing is putting it into a little binder. It's not that much. It's really only about 7 documents that would be legal documents, and then of course the state forms, all the accounting forms. But if you have it in a binder and you can make duplicates of it and change the specific sections in the employment agreement, it always helps you when you're growing and when you're hiring more employees. You always have it in one specific place, and you're able to just revise the documents upon consultation with your accountant and legal counsel. So hopefully this podcast was able to tie together a lot of pieces of why we've talked in the past about employee handbooks and about the exempt versus non-exempt status, and it really ties it in together and how it's very important, especially during the time of onboarding, and how it's important to have those documents right at the time when somebody is hired. But if you have any questions on anything we've talked about in the past, or of course anything today, please feel free to reach out to either Jane or I. We're always here to help. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.